Prepare yourself for the unknown, where fear isn't just an emotion but a constant presence. Here, terror intertwines with mystery, pushing you face your deepest nightmares. If you're searching for more than just scares, do you crave the thrill of your heart racing as you explore the dark, then this is the place for you. Join us and discover what truly haunts when the lights go out and the shadows close in. It was one of those nights where the darkness felt heavier, as if the veil of night was hiding something beyond the ordinary. Jack, a man accustomed to the peaceful life of the countryside, was heading home after a long, exhausting day at work. The dirt road, flanked by towering trees and unsettling shadows, was the only path leading to his home. The car radio was tuned to a local station, playing an old, almost hypnotic melody. As he drove, something caught his eye. He noticed faint lights flickering between the trees, something he had never seen on this stretch before. Curiosity, mixed with an inexplicable sense of unease, made him slow down. What could it be? Campsite? The headlights of another vehicle? Against the instinct that told him to keep going, Jack decided to investigate. He parked the car by the roadside, grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, and stepped out, feeling the cold wind brush against his skin. The lights continued to flicker, as if calling him, drawing him deeper into the darkness. Each step he took towards the forest felt heavier, as if the very ground was trying to hold him back, knowing he was entering territory that wasn't his to tread. As he got closer, the silence of the night was broken by a distant sound, almost imperceptible, a muffled cry. Jack froze, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Something was definitely wrong, but as if under a spell, he continued, ignoring the growing fear that began to pulse through his veins. The flashlight's beam revealed tracks on the ground, marks of something being dragged into the depths of the forest. Deeper and deeper, Jack approached the source of those lights, and the sound, now clearer, more distressing. He wasn't prepared for what was coming next. The night, which began like any other, was about to turn into a nightmare. The next day, dawn brought an uneasy feeling to the small community where Jack lived. He hadn't returned home, and his car, abandoned by the roadside, was found with the first light of day, sparking concern among his neighbors. Jack was known for his punctuality and responsibility, never failing to let someone know if something was wrong. But that morning, he seemed to have vanished without a trace. The local police were quickly called, and the sheriff, an experienced and skeptical man, began to investigate the case. He knew Jack well and was certain he wasn't the type to get into trouble. However, when he came across the empty car and the fallen flashlight, something at the back of his mind started to disturb him. He could feel that this wasn't a typical missing person case. The search began immediately. Tracking dogs were brought in, following Jack's scent to the forest's edge, where the trees closed in with a dark embrace, blocking out nearly all sunlight. The dogs barked restlessly, tugging at their leashes as if trying to warn the officers of an unseen danger. The usually calm sheriff felt a chill run down his spine. There was something wrong in that forest, something that even the most trained animals hesitated to approach. As the officers followed the trail, they found marks on the ground, as if someone had struggled to break free. Torn clothing and a bit of dried blood indicated that Jack hadn't left willingly. The trees seemed to whisper ancient secrets, secrets no one really wanted to hear. Jack's disappearance quickly became the main topic in town. Everyone had their theories. Some said he was taken by wild animals, others whispered about strange cults rumored to inhabit those woods. But no one had the courage to delve deep into the forest to uncover the truth. No one, except the sheriff, who knew he had to find Jack, alive or dead, before something worse happened. But the deeper he and his team ventured, the more fear crept into their hearts. What they were about to discover would be far more terrifying than any of them could have imagined. As the search party pushed further into the forest, the daylight began to fade, swallowed by the dense canopy overhead. The sound of branches snapping underfoot seemed to echo throughout the woods, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. The sheriff led the group, but even he could feel the oppressive presence of the place, as if the forest was watching them, waiting for a moment of weakness. They followed the tracking dogs, which seemed uncertain, moving reluctantly. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. But there was something else. Faint metallic smell that began to mingle with the surroundings. The sheriff, not one to be easily frightened, felt his mind scream a warning he couldn't ignore. As they advanced, they stumbled upon something partially buried under the fallen leaves. It was an old, rusted metal sign, almost illegible, but with some effort the sheriff deciphered it. Private property. That revelation didn't make sense at first glance. Who in their right mind would build a property in such a dense, isolated forest? And why did no one know about it? Up ahead, the vegetation began to clear, revealing an unexpected opening. In the center, hidden by the foliage, was an old, dilapidated house, like a ghost from the past. The windows were shattered, and the wooden walls looked ready to collapse. But what caught everyone's attention the most was the overwhelming sense of evil emanating from the place. As if those walls held secrets that should never have been uncovered. The dogs began to bark uncontrollably, pulling at their leashes toward the house, while the group hesitated, sensing they were on the brink of something terrible. The sheriff, fighting against the fear crawling inside him, signaled for everyone to approach cautiously. He knew that retreating at that moment would be worse, because whatever was happening inside was about to be revealed. They approached the door, which was ajar, as if waiting for them. And that was when the sheriff heard it. A sound he would never forget. A low moan, a muffled cry, coming from inside the house. He exchanged a grim look with his men before pushing the door open slowly, revealing an interior that seemed to have been pulled straight from a nightmare. The darkness inside was thicker, and the smell they had noticed outside was now unbearable. Dried blood stained the wooden floor, and claw marks covered the walls like remnants of a desperate struggle. But the worst was yet to come. In the back of the room, chained and barely breathing, was Jack. His body was covered in wounds, and his eyes, filled with terror, pleaded for help. But there was something else there. Something that shouldn't have been alive. Something waiting for them in the shadows, ready to drag them into the depths of the forest, where no one would ever find them again. Inside the house, the atmosphere was suffocating, laden with an ancient evil that seemed to have rooted itself in the decaying walls. The sheriff and his men were paralyzed for a moment, staring at Jack, who was in a pitiful state, his vacant eyes reflecting deep panic. But before they could react, a harsh noise echoed through the house, the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps, as if something was approaching, slow and deliberate. Suddenly, the inner doors burst open with a crash, and a group of grotesque figures emerged from the shadows. Men and women, disfigured by time and cruelty, their faces marked by scars and eyes filled with sadistic pleasure. They held crude weapons, rusty machetes, axes, chains, and wore disturbing smiles, as if they were about to revel in the suffering of others. The sheriff immediately realized the danger, but before he could issue an order, the intruders launched themselves at them with animalistic ferocity. The small house turned into a brutal battleground, where every movement was a desperate fight for survival. Screams of pain and terror filled the air as the madness of those beings was fully revealed. As he struggled to keep the attackers at bay, the sheriff began to understand the true nature of that perverse family. They weren't mere killers, they were hunters. But unlike ordinary hunters who seek wild animals, these monstrous beings hunted people. For them, forest was a hunting ground, and anyone unlucky enough to cross their path became their prey. Jack, still chained, watched the scene with a mix of horror and relief. He had been the prey that fateful night, captured, tortured, and now feared the others were destined for the same fate. But there was something even more terrifying about the situation. The evident pleasure in the hunter's eyes, as if the pain and fear of their victims were a form of entertainment. The sheriff, fighting with all his might, knew they were in a desperate situation. He and his men were strong and well-trained. The hunters had the advantage of madness and familiarity with the terrain. Every blow delivered by the intruders seemed more deadly, every breath harder to maintain. However, amidst the chaos, the sheriff noticed something that could be their only chance. The chains holding Jack were weakened, perhaps due to time or constant use. If he could free him, they would have a chance, however slim, to turn the tide. One last effort, He advanced toward Jack, ignoring the throbbing pain in his body. As one of the hunters approached, the sheriff managed to free Jack from the chains. Jack's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope, but also with a dark determination. They wouldn't run. They would fight. And this fight, in those forest depths, would be a deadly game where only the strongest would survive. As Jack and the sheriff braced themselves for the next wave of attacks, the sound of agonized screams echoed through the house. They were distant screams, but so deeply filled with terror that they seemed to pierce the soul. Those screams didn't come from the police officers who had been captured or injured. They came from somewhere else, from the dark and forgotten depths of that cursed forest. The hunters paused momentarily, their macabre expressions twisting into wicked smiles. It was as if those screams were a symphony to them, prelude to even greater violence yet to come. The sheriff felt a chill run down his spine. He knew they weren't alone in that forest, and whoever or whatever was screaming could be even more terrifying than the monsters surrounding them. Jack, now free from the chains, grabbed an improvised weapon, a piece of wood with a sharp point, and positioned himself beside the sheriff. They exchanged no words, but the understanding between them was clear. Whatever was coming, they would have to face it together. But the question hanging in the air, unanswered, was, were they ready to face whatever it was? The screams grew louder, closer, as if something was slowly approaching them, but with an unstoppable certainty. The sound reverberated through the wooden walls of the house, turning it into a chamber of echoed fear. The hunters, who had been ravenous for the hunt before, now seemed agitated, uneasy, as if they were waiting for something even they feared. Then, suddenly, one of the hunters, a tall woman with deep scars across her face, began to laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but a laugh of pure madness, from someone who had crossed the threshold of sanity. She looked directly at Jack and the sheriff, her eyes gleaming with insane malice. "Did you hear that?" she murmured, her voice quivering with excitement. "They're coming." Before the sheriff could ask who they were, the woman took a step forward, her eyes never leaving theirs. "We're not the only hunters here," she whispered, as if revealing an ancient and terrible secret. "And sometimes, even we become the prey." The tension in the room was palpable as the sheriff tried to process what that meant. But he didn't have time to think. Suddenly, the back door of the house was smashed open with brutal force, and the distant screams turned into a cacophony of terror. Something or someone was about to enter, and whatever it was, it wouldn't let anyone leave alive. The smashed door swayed ominously, prelude to what was about to enter. The sound of the screams was replaced by a deadly silence, dense and suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Jack and the sheriff, hearts pounding, prepared for the worst. The hunters, who had been full of confidence moments before, now looked anxious, their eyes darting nervously between each other, as if they were about to face something that even surpassed their monstrous nature. Outside, heavy footsteps approached, the sound of branches snapping and dry leaves being crushed filling the air. The shadows beyond the door began to stretch and distort, as if something immense was about to materialize from the darkness. Then, as if pulled from the depths of the night, it appeared. A grotesque, tall, inhuman figure entered through the door, its eyes glowing with supernatural malice. Its skin was pale and stretched, marked by deep, ancient scars, and its limbs were long and misshapen, as if molded by nightmares themselves. The creature seemed to be a fusion of man and beast, an aberration that didn't belong to this world. The hunters, who until then had been the predators, recoiled in terror. One of them tried to flee but was quickly captured by the creature, which lifted him into the air as if he were a mere doll. With a violent motion, the hunter was thrown against the wall with overwhelming force, his body collapsing as if made of paper. The sound of bones breaking echoed through the room, followed by a silence that was almost deafening. Jack and the sheriff were paralyzed, unable to process the horror they were witnessing. The creature wasn't just a physical being, but seemed to carry with it an aura of pure evil, as if its presence drained life and sanity from everything around it. But what terrified them even more was the realization that this wasn't an isolated entity. It was the leader, the true hunter, and the human monsters they had faced before were merely its minions. The creature looked at Jack and the sheriff, its bloodshot eyes fixed on them, as if deciding who the next victim would be. The sheriff, driven by a primal survival instinct, grabbed Jack's arm and pulled him out of the room, away from that infernal being. The creature didn't follow them immediately. Instead, it smiled, a macabre smile full of sharp teeth, as if savoring their fear. As they fled through the forest, the screams of the hunters being torn apart echoed behind them, mingling with the creature's twisted laughter. Jack and the sheriff now knew that what they had discovered in that house was just the tip of the iceberg, and that the dark truth was far worse than they could have imagined. They weren't just running from cruel killers, but from something beyond human comprehension, something that turned hunters into prey, and fed on the terror it created. And the worst part? They knew that no matter how fast they ran, the darkness would follow them, because the forest was now their prison, and the creature their warden. Running through the forest, Jack and the sheriff could hear the echo of the hunters' screams, turning into distant, distorted sounds, as if swallowed by the shadows. Each step felt like an eternity, each breath, painful effort to avoid being dragged into the madness that seemed to emanate from all sides. The darkness around them wasn't just physical, it was an oppressive presence that weighed on their souls, making every movement harder. The sheriff, though exhausted, kept a firm hand on Jack's shoulder, guiding him through the trees and undergrowth in a desperate attempt to find a way out. But the forest, as if it were a living entity, seemed to conspire against them. The trees, once familiar, now loomed like menacing towers, their branches reaching out like claws trying to grasp them. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, becoming unstable, as if the very earth wanted to swallow them whole. The creature wasn't far behind. Its heavy, slow footsteps echoed through the forest, constant reminder that their time running out. There was no escaping this nightmare. The sheriff knew that, but he couldn't allow panic to overtake him. They had to keep running. They had to find a way to survive. Suddenly, they stumbled into a clearing. At its center stood an old hunting cabin, worn by time but still standing. With no other options, they ran inside, barricading the door behind them. The cabin was small and cramped, with broken windows that let in the cold wind and the whispers of the trees. The sheriff frantically searched for something they could use as a weapon. He found an old shotgun, rusty, but maybe still functional. Jack, breathing heavily, looked at the sheriff with wide eyes. He knew they were trapped, that the cabin was only a temporary refuge. But at that moment, it was the only thing standing between them and the creature. The cabin fell silent, broken only by the heavy breathing of the two men. But suddenly that silence was shattered by a terrible sound. The scratching of the creature's claws against the wooden door. It was there on the other side, waiting. Didn't need to force its way in. Knew they had nowhere to go. The creature was only playing, savoring the terror emanating from within the cabin. The sheriff raised the shotgun, aiming it at the door. He knew it was a desperate measure, that such an old weapon would hardly stop what was outside. But he also knew he couldn't just give up. Jack, beside him, grabbed an old knife he found on a table, his fingers trembling, but his resolve firm to fight until the end. The creature began to pound on the door, each blow making the entire cabin tremble. The wood creaked, the walls seemed to shrink, and the air was thick with the smell of rot and death. The sheriff exchanged a final look with Jack, a silent understanding that this could be the end. But if it was, they would go down fighting, no matter how desperate the situation. With one final crash, the door exploded, and the creature lunged forward, its monstrous figure filling the doorway. The sheriff pulled the trigger, blast echoing through the cabin, but the shot seemed futile, only delaying the inevitable. Jack screamed as the creature advanced, ready to finish what it had started. They were on the brink of the abyss, and the struggle for survival became increasingly desperate, with death circling them like a relentless predator. The gunshot echoed through the cabin, a desperate attempt to resist the inevitable. The sheriff gripped the shotgun tightly, his eyes locked on the advancing creature, seemingly unfazed by the shot. The impact had only slowed its advance, but not enough. The sharp claws scraped against the wooden floor as the monster moved forward with cold, relentless determination. Jack, his heart pounding wildly, lunged at the creature with the rusty knife. In a desperate move, he tried to stab the being that hunted them. The blade barely scratched the creature's toughened skin. It looked at him with a cruel amusement, as if his futile attempt at defense was a sadistic joke. The sheriff, realizing there was no other way out, dropped the shotgun and grabbed an old torch leaning against a corner. He lit the wick with trembling hands, flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. With a war cry, he swung the torch at the creature, the heat of the flames briefly illuminating its terrifying face. But that moment of hope was quickly crushed as the creature advanced again, ignoring the flames, its only goal to satiate its hunger for terror and destruction. The sheriff and Jack were cornered, with death practically breathing down their necks. Then a terrifying voice emerged from the creature's lips, saying that no captured prey could escape. Its cold, fierce eyes turning to the sheriff. As if it entered his mind, it offered an indecent proposal. The sheriff was there as an intruder, not as prey. He hadn't been captured, so he had no value to the creature or the hunters, but his courage and skill with weapons were worthy of a hunter. The sheriff had only two options: die cornered, cruel and meaningless death, or kill Jack, ending his cycle of prey and torture. Would the creature let him escape? The sheriff had so many questions. Then Jack turned to him and asked what was happening. They couldn't stop fighting and trying to escape. In a moment of distraction, the creature approached Jack, immobilizing him, and directed its attention one last time to the sheriff. "Do you want to become a hunter? Or after killing this vermin, shall I kill you?" Without hesitation, the sheriff grabbed the shotgun from the floor and shot Jack, killing him instantly. The creature began to laugh grotesquely and eerily. Then, outside, a different sound was heard. A long, guttural howl, followed by heavy footsteps that shook the ground around the cabin. At the cabin's threshold, cloaked in the forest shadows, appeared a second figure, even more monstrous and horrifying than the first. Its eyes glowed with malevolent light, and a distorted smile formed on its nightmarish face. Followed by the hunters who captured Jack. They were exhausted, wounded, but alive. Would the sheriff now become one of them? The creature bluffed. He had killed Jack to save himself, but was he a monster? He had so many questions. What would he do now? All his men were dead, and now he was a murderer. Until the deeply scarred woman he saw earlier approached him, blood on her hands and a disturbing smile. She looked deep into his eyes and whispered with a cold, terrifying voice, "Now you're one of us." Who would have thought a sheriff would join our family? And amidst the laughter she added, "Everyone here was once ordinary people, doctors, businessmen, teachers. We chose to embrace our true nature and passion. Watching human pain and suffering, ordinary people are so fragile, their bodies so tasty, and the fear in their eyes feeds our hungry souls. If you think about exposing us, fleeing your fate, or backing out of the pact you just sealed by killing your friend, we will hunt your family, one by one, your loved ones." A voice among the hunters shouted, "Maybe that's what we want to do anyway." And they all laughed. Then she added, "So every 7 days, you'll bring us supplies, weapons, and anything we want, and we'll hunt together. After all, we're a family now. I'll find you, Sheriff, so don't worry about looking for me, just be ready." Surprisingly, she placed a hand on his shoulder and kissed his forehead, and one by one, they disappeared into the forest without a trace, leaving the sheriff there alone and unsure of what to do. He returned to the cabin, looked at Jack's body, and felt a pang of pleasure, then returned to where his men had been brutally slaughtered. Some were still there, others were missing limbs. So that night, the sheriff decided to sleep there, among the dead. The next morning, called for reinforcements and had the bodies recovered and buried out of respect for their families. After all, he had a duty to the community. What he couldn't explain was the growing desire in his heart for blood and hunting. Something inside him had changed. And so, as the night stretched on in silence, day after day, he understood that the true nature of the evil he had faced couldn't be comprehended. That forest, that cabin, were just gateways to something greater. Something lurking in the darkness, patiently waiting for its next victim. And he was hungry for the next hunt. His features changed drastically in a short time, and within a few months he vanished without a trace. everything indicating that he had joined his new family and their new disturbing habits. Before disappearing, he left a letter for his wife, saying only, "Daylight doesn't always chase away the shadows that follow us. True terror doesn't just hide in the darkness, but also in the most sunny and joyful moment. Because what really brings this horror to light is the burning desire some have to hunt the defenseless and see the despair in the eyes of the innocent. And in the end, it's your own frequency that attracts or repels this dark company. The question that remains is, what would you do if no one could see you?" If you, like us, felt the chills down your spine and your heart racing with every twist in this story, then you're in the right place. Here, the terror doesn't end when the night falls. With each new video, we explore the darkest depths of the human mind and the mysteries the world prefers to leave forgotten. Subscribe now and join our community of horror lovers. Get ready for more stories that go beyond what the eyes can see and will stay with you long after the lights go out. Don't miss the next chapter of terror. Here, fear is constant. And remember, in the darkness, we're all hunters or prey.